Support for On Brand and all shows on the Marketing Podcast Network is provided by Storyblock. Think of your content management system. Now think of it being able to update the other 5, 10, or even 20 places you need those prices or product descriptions changed. Update content once, publish it everywhere. Sign up for a free account to see how simple content management can be. Go to storyblock.com/onbrand. That's Storyblock without the C.com/onbrand. The worst thing about influencer marketing for scrappy small businesses is that all that fancy software is too expensive, right? Reach Influencers solves the problem. Now your small business can find, engage, and manage micro and nano influencers, the ones you can afford to work with. And Reach Influencers cost as low as $100 per month. Are you kidding me? No, it's true. Go to capturetheinfluence.com/podcast and see for yourself. Find, engage, manage, influence with software built and priced for you. More at capturetheinfluence.com/podcast. I'm Nick Westergaard, and this is On Brand, helping you tell your story. My guest this week is Robert L. Dilenschneider.
Everybody kind of wants to tell the story with their own words, but oftentimes their own words don't work with the audience you're trying to reach. So you need to really totally research the audience, totally research what moves them, what language moves them, what language do they use in their own day-to-day work. And you need to find a way to translate that into what you're trying to communicate, so that when you communicate, the person says, aha, that's me. I understand it. Let's go for it.
Robert Dilenschneider is the founder of the Dilenschneider Group. Headquartered in New York and Chicago, the firm provides strategic advice and counsel to Fortune 500 companies and leading families and individuals around the world, with experience in fields ranging from mergers and acquisitions and crisis communication to marketing, government affairs, and international media. Mr. Dilenschneider has been called the Dean of American Public Relations Executives and is widely published, having authored and edited 17 books, including the Public Relations Handbook. Robert, welcome to On Brand.
Absolutely terrific to be here. Your show and you personally have a wonderful reputation, so it's a great courtesy to be with you.
Well, that I will take that compliment from anyone known as the Dean of American Public Relations Executives. I feel like that I'm blessed and official at this point.
Thank you.
So listeners of the show know that I love words and definitions and especially the somewhat at times confusing definitions that we have in the industry of marketing and communication. So talk a bit about this label that you fall under and your work does, public relations, because I sometimes think that it's one of these things that people are quick to assume has changed, but talk a bit about public relations today.
It's really very simple. It's a matter of defining your point of view and making sure that people you need to reach understand your point of view. I remember being with a man named Jay Pritzker in Chicago at one time. He was the head of the Pritzker family. They owned the Hyatt hotel chain and everything else. Billionaire, many times over. And we were in Jay's car driving to O'Hare, talking about his message. We got his message right. And I said, Jay, how many people should we tell this to? And Jay said, 2, just 2 people. I said, pardon me? I said, this is a message for thousands. He said, I only want to get it to 2 people. If 2 people get it, understand it, and take action on it, we've achieved our goal. And that's a lesson I learned way, way back when, which is always define your audience. A lot of people say we're going to reach the world, we're going to reach hundreds of thousands of people. You generally don't have to. You have to reach a few people who can make a decision that's in the interest of your client and get them to do that. So that's really what it is. It's a matter of giving people enough information, giving them enough persuasion, giving them enough direction so they can reach out and help your client. That's what it is.
Well, and that's an interesting story too, because it's about people, as you just said, but also specifically the right people. I think a lot of times I pick on labels like advertising and even new ones like content marketing, but when we talk about public relations, I think that story specifically highlights that an assumption a lot of the time is that it's to do exactly what you'd said before of blanketing it to the masses, when it's really about some of those early questions of who needs to know this, right?
That's right. Who needs to know this, and what action can they take that is helpful to you? It's almost like a jury in a courtroom. You have 12 people in the jury. You've got to reach all 12 one way or the other. All those people out in the body of the courtroom, with all respect, they don't make much of a decision. They don't do much. The jury has to be convinced, and they have to be convinced one by one by one. And if they are, you win the case. If they're not, it's a different story.
Well, that's a great example too, and I think especially when talking about you kind of adding a question, a criteria in defining that audience, I think is key for folks to consider as well. That it's both the who question and then what happens. And I would imagine sometimes, someone might listen to that and think, okay, well, there's a couple of audiences here. So what's the strategy at that point?
First thing you really have to do is get your message the way you want to get it. And you have to use language, words, phrases, examples that are going to sell the group you're trying to talk to. That's not an easy task because everybody kind of wants to tell the story with their own words, but oftentimes their own words don't work with the audience you're trying to reach. So you need to really totally research the audience, totally research what moves them, what language moves them, what language do they use in their own day-to-day work. And you need to find a way to translate that into what you're trying to communicate, so that when you communicate, the person says, aha, that's me. I understand it. Let's go for it. That's very difficult to do, but it's really important to do. Too often in this business, people just come to a situation and say, well, this is what we're going to do, and throw it against the wall. It's actually counterproductive. It doesn't work. So you have to be very careful about how you communicate to make sure that what you say, how you say it, the examples of what you say, the visual look, should there be a visual to it, all reach the audience in a way that the audience is comfortable. You're not going to have an easy time convincing somebody of a point of view if it's totally 100% different from how they think.
Well, that's such an important point, as you said, and I feel like it is something that many are missing. And they think about here's what we want to say, here's what we need to say point, instead of, and then, that's an important start, but it's missing that critical step, because I think that it can be a big dose of reality, that phrase you said early on previously about your language often doesn't work. And is there a step if you have an audience, like should you I feel like you could maybe put together some sort of handbook or something that captures some of those key points about audience languages. Is that an approach that an organization might employ?
It's absolutely critical to do that. I don't care if you're the biggest company in the world or a small family trying to communicate. You have to figure out what language the audience you're communicating to understands and uses. And you have to use that language and those examples, if there are examples, to get your story across. That's absolutely the first thing that should be done. So while your story is important and you want to tell it, make sure you tell it in a way that the audience will understand it and take it in terms of the way they think about it.
And,
not easy, by the way.
No, not at all. Not at all. And as I was thinking about that, your work has ranged from media, government affairs, marketing, organizations, families, and there's I'd say that challenge applies to all of those different areas. I'm not going to say marketing's perfect by any means, but sometimes there is at least a little more of a consideration of audience voice sometimes, again, and we don't always get that right. But I think especially when you talk about organizational communications, that's where it seems like there's a lot of layers of business speak that you have to kind of, it just seems like in the woods, kind of like chopping through with a machete to get to what the point is from the audience perspective.
For sure. Let me just use a couple of examples. Let's say you want to communicate with a congressman. Well, you can tell your story to the congressman, but it's better if you understand this congressman's story and couch your story within that. So if the congressman's, let's say, for example, is really speaking about older people and help for older people, then you need to take your story and cast it in terms of how it helps older people. That will get the congressman to respond right away. It'll show him or her that you understand their position and you're giving them information that can help them. Same is true for virtually everybody in society. So understand the needs, the way the audience you're communicating with speaks, and try to put your message in their terms.
On Brand will be right back after this.
This Pride, everyone's coming through for the Trevor Project on YouTube Shorts. Join us! Create a short showing how you're stepping up for Pride using the hashtag YouTube Pride Challenge. Come through for Pride on YouTube Shorts. Visit youtube.com/pride.
Hey there, it's Jason Falls. If your company or maybe one of your clients sells to marketers, you look for advertising channels that guarantee business marketers are paying attention, right? Let me introduce you to the Marketing Podcast Network. You're listening to it right now. It's a network of podcasts all about marketing. So 100% of MPN's audience are marketers. Reach them by advertising on the Marketing Podcast Network. Learn more and find our media kit at marketingpodcasts.net.
Now, back to the show. So one thing that I really love about your most recent work, the Public Relations Handbook, which has topics including public relations in higher education, communication in Europe, global context. But your introduction specifically, I think, kind of to that very point you were just making on why public relations matters is really important because you kind of set it up in this. I don't know. Speaking of labels, I don't know what we're calling this now. If it's safe to call it post-pandemic and knock wood. I don't think. Speaking of language, I don't think anybody really knows how to talk about all of this yet. But I think that's a really interesting context for public relations, for better, for worse, because it's been a challenge specifically when we look at that. Could you say more on that?
It's probably the heart of the issue that people trying to communicate have to deal with. They've got to figure out a way to put a benefit with whatever they're communicating and sell that benefit in terms of the audience that they're reaching. Again, not an easy task. I always say to clients, those I'm talking to, let's spend some time developing a lexicon, words, examples that we can use to tell your story. client automatically says, well, I've got my story. I know exactly what it is. And after the end of the session, their story really hasn't changed, but the language and the examples they use to tell their story have totally changed. And then their story begins to get across. That's the key to the whole thing.
Well, and you mentioned story in there, and I said I'd love to pick on definitions, and I feel like story has been, we have things like public relations that have been here all along, advertising, marketing, and then every now and then there's these ones that kind of seem to be in the headlines of all of the articles talking about your story and brand storytelling. And to what you just said of, we know our story, I always kind of push back on that just a little bit, because while you might know what you want to talk about, I'm not sure we always frame it correctly. How do you get to the bottom of what a useful brand story is?
Very difficult. And again, what you have to constantly say to the client or the person you're communicating with is this what you want to say? And how will saying this get you what you're looking for? Those are two really key questions. One, is this what you want to say? Two is, by saying this, will you get what you want? Those are key questions. Oftentimes, people can't answer that. They'll say, of course it's what I want to say. Well, actually, it turns out it oftentimes isn't. Of course I want to say this. Well, oftentimes that doesn't get to the result you're seeking. So it's really critical to be able to answer those questions. This is really a process that requires some very careful thinking that has to be done when you're trying to communicate a story.
So I mentioned earlier your book, the Public Relations Handbook, and what I really like about this, we talked about your introduction, but you have curated a handbook of some of these leading areas. I mentioned some of them before, but you've got investor relations. You've got government, global issues and affairs, families, like you've been talking about. How in rounding up the work that is putting together a handbook, how did you determine what should be in a public relations handbook? I mean, writing something is hard enough, but editing something and not having it, come off the shelf and make a great big thud like the phone book is difficult. How did you decide what were the most prescient issues in public relations today?
I tried to say to myself, what are the elements that are going to make up a communication? And I then said, well, research is one. So we got Frank Luntz to write that chapter. Investor relations is one. We got Art Gormley to write that chapter. So it's just a matter of saying, what are the elements that are going to make up the story that our client wants to communicate? That's how those chapters were selected. There are many chapters that were not selected, so they're not in the book. But that's the way to do it. Those people, by the way, who are writing in the handbook, I went to great lengths to get people I thought were the smartest people in the world. And so it's not just me; it's me and others talking about a topic that's in the book.
Well, again, and I would back that up, like you said, the experts, and you've definitely got them, and I think that the work, like I said, of curating that, and again making a useful book. It's like the old saying of a shorter, more time to write the shorter letter. I think having it be a manageable sized book, because everybody could avoid the question that you just posed and just toss everything into some sort of unwieldy encyclopedia. but you've got really a useful, aptly named handbook here. Speaking of useful, one thing that comes up a lot is crisis communication. Talk a bit about, I mean, this I feel like was, I don't know what form of media to go all the way back to, but I'm sure, even print media, town criers, everything in older eras was challenging enough, but it's certainly got even harder over the past few decades with digital media, always on 24-hour news cycle. How can organizations, brands of all shapes and sizes, be crisis ready?
Crisis communications is a fantastic buzzword. Everybody uses it. I'm actually known for crisis communications and being able to handle it. The truth is, if you do it correctly, you don't have crisis communications. Do things go wrong in an organization, in a human life, in a family? Sure they do. And it's just really then a matter of how do you correct it quickly. So there's no, again, ABC to working in a crisis. Each one is different. And each one requires a different point of view and a different way of going at it. But if it's done properly and done quickly, then you're going to be very successful. I used to work with a man named Bill Durbin, and Bill taught me something very important. In a crisis, he said, tell it all and tell it fast and get it all behind you. And that has worked really many times for me, stretching out. It's just a critical thing. Right here in my own community, we've got an individual who's quite prominent, and he's being attacked for having a relationship with a woman and actually paying her on his staff to have this conduct. Well, that's a crisis for him, but it really shouldn't be. He should be able to get beyond that. And if he takes the advice I gave him this morning, he will. We'll see.
I love that the quote. Who was the name on the tell it all, tell it fast? Again, I want to make sure we get that credit.
Bill Durbin. Bill Durbin was a terrific executive. He was one of the top executives in Hill and Knowlton. He was responsible for the international segment of Hill and Knowlton. I remember going to Saudi Arabia with Bill, and in Riyadh, one of the major towns in Saudi, he used that phrase, tell it all and tell it fast. The Saudis didn't quite know what it meant, so we had to define it for them. And once they figured it out, we had a great client, and Saudi Arabia was very successful.
Well, I think an important thing at the heart of that because as I heard that, I'm like, why is that so hard for us? And I think it's scary, but I think in my head that dynamic makes sense because I always think of it like as a pressure that is building. And tell it all, tell it fast. You're releasing the valve. You're letting that pressure off immediately. And the tell it fast part, if you don't open that valve all the way up, you're still got that pressure in there that's building. And I feel like it's that tell it fast, that last part that we often miss out on because we want to see how much we can get by with. How much do they need to, how can we just do this and will that be enough? And
dribbling your story out there is a big mistake.
Yeah. And why does that, is it for that reason that people tend to, dribble?
Yeah, I think it is, yes. Nobody really wants to deal with a negative situation. We all want positive situations, but the truth, most of the situations we deal with do have a negative implications. So you got to think that through and figure out what you're going to do about it.
So your work has also beyond the public relations work that we've talked about. You've also done a lot of work in your books on leadership, on power, and career. Is there something in navigating leadership today that relates to what we're talking about when it comes to public relations?
I think there is. Every situation demands a leader. Oftentimes, people don't want to be leaders because they just don't want to be out there and get the attention that leaders receive. On the other hand, if there is no leader, you'll never get to a solution. So you've got to identify a leader. Frequently, it is not the CEO of a company. It's not a top executive in a company. It could be somebody in the middle of the company that everybody has respect for. And when that individual says something, the entire organization snaps too. You've got to figure out who that person is and help them become a leader. You've got to tell that person that being a leader is a responsibility for them because so many people depend on what they say. And by being a leader is going to have enormous implications for the organization generally. So you have no alternative except to do that.
On that front, I like that you mentioned, that it doesn't have to be the CEO, because I think another assumption is whoever is making that determination of what you just said based on something arbitrary in the org chart, and that might not be. It's just like that question earlier on of framing it. Your language might not work on people. The people that you might think should be in front of people aren't always that. And an obvious example is Facebook and the challenges that Mark Zuckerberg has had that were offset through the years by Sheryl Sandberg, who people do empathize with and enjoy hearing from. So that transition there will be tricky as they navigate that. Advice internally for kind of just like finding out which words work, figuring out who might be your best organizational face for your story.
Absolutely critical. You mentioned Zuckerberg. I don't want to be critical of Zuckerberg. He's obviously much more successful than I am. But
Yeah.
One of the things Zuckerberg should have done, in addition to Sandberg, is get dozens of people inside Meta and get them to speak out in his behalf. That would have been very important. He never did that. He took it all on himself. He should have gotten everybody, or many people from different walks of the organization to make a point on his behalf. That would have made a huge difference.
Well, and that's why he's so easy to cite too, because as you just said that, it made me think, yeah, that challenging reputation that he has is a result of taking all of that. Like you said, there, for the longest time weren't any other faces for that to go with. And it's impacted his personal brand reputation, which is very much related to the organizational brand.
He put himself out there and he was the only person to take a shot at. So he had a lot of positives, but many, many negatives. He didn't have to do it.
Yeah, and another kind of coming back to bringing everything that we've been talking about together, also just on various fronts, frequently dribbling out information, and sometimes even hard to get even that dribble too, and that's why I think you have so much pressure and tumult around Facebook and Meta.
If you tell the whole story and somebody then comes up with a major question, you can say, didn't you hear me tell this part of the story? And refer back to it. So
Yeah.
Put a circle around your story and constantly refer back to your story. Don't make up new things.
That is such valuable insight, and I feel like this has been a public relations masterclass from the Dean of American Public Relations Executives. But it is time for me to ask you, Robert, for a brand that has made you smile recently.
One of the things that make me smile is this, and maybe it's a good thing to conclude with. I have a very good friend, a brilliant man, absolutely brilliant, who has ALS, and he's failing by the day. And I've tried to think of what I can give this man that'll make him smile. And here's what we've done. My wife, who is quite a good painter, many years ago had a show in Paris. She was just beginning. This man came over and bought one of her paintings in the early days, gave her a real lift up. What I'm going to do is send one of my wife's current paintings, and she's very well received now, to this man and thank him for giving her a start on her way. That makes me smile. And hopefully he's going to smile too.
That is a great story, and I think it's always special when a smile begets another smile, and years later everything comes back full circle as well.
Name of the game.
Yeah, absolutely. Robert, where can folks go to learn more about who you are and what you do?
Well, we've got a website, of course, and if anybody wants to do that, they can go to the website. We've written 18 books. There are a lot of things in those books that are helpful. We do a lot of lecturing on college campuses, and oftentimes the lectures are reprinted. People can just call me or write me if they want to, and I'll be as open with them as I can possibly be. People oftentimes want to know things. Sometimes you have to tell them things that they don't want to hear, but it's important to tell them that so that everybody's on the same page and communicating properly.
Absolutely. Well, again, this has been a fascinating conversation, and we'll link up to everything in our show notes at onbrandpodcast.com. Robert, thanks for being on brand with us.
It's just great to be on the show with you. You've got a great reputation. The show has a wonderful reputation. And for people listening, and I'm sure there are many listening, you're really made a wise choice.
On Brand is part of the Marketing Podcast Network. If you like what you're hearing, if we've made you smile, you can always listen free on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or whatever your favorite platform may be. And please take a moment and rate and review the podcast to help others find the show. Until next week, I'm Nick Westergaard, and I'll see you on the internet.
This podcast is heard along the Marketing Podcast Network. For more great marketing podcasts, visit marketingpodcasts.net.